Thanks, Ken. Just a little history. Ken and I got to know each other some more than a decade ago. I was one of the editors of a volume of research papers about the Michigan economy called Michigan at the Millennium. And he wrote a chapter for us about population and demographics. And in fact, he provided one of the slides from from his chapter in the book I'm going to use with appropriate attribution later today. He sent me his the other day, and I thought, wow, there's not a whole lot left for me to say, but I'm going to try to fit in some of the gaps. Some of the things that I say will be amplifying some of the points that have already been made, and I will also touch on a few other things. So I think you have a handout. You can follow along, but I've got the screen here. Why do people go where they go? Well, there are lots of reasons, but certainly one of them is economic opportunity. This shows some of the longer-term trends in Michigan's population. We joined the Union in 1837, so 1840 was the first time when Michigan was part of the census, and we had about 200,000 people back then in a place that was still mostly forest. And then you can see the increase in population fairly steadily during the 19th century, and then a big speed up in the early 20th century. Why? Because Michigan was becoming the world's center for innovation, especially in manufacturing. It's amazing to look back at the history of the people who made Michigan what it is. Henry Ford, Herbert Dow, Ransom Olds, W.K. Kellogg, W.E. Upjohn, they were all born in the 1860s and 70s, and they all transformed the industry in which they were involved in around the turn of the century and in the first decade or two of the 20th century. And so we had rapid population growth as the auto sector and others were growing. Then the 30s was a slowdown with the Great Depression, but then we had this acceleration. But then it slowed down and eventually turned down, and as you saw from one of Ken's slides, it's just barely begun to turn up. Even if it's going up, in a straight line, that means that the rate of growth, percentage rate of growth, is slowing down. And then when it's flattening out, that means that the percentage rate of growth is really slowing down. One of the points that I think needs to be made about it is that this isn't exactly a completely contemporaneous relationship. It's not as if the economy does bad and immediately we lose population. Rather, it's trends that happen with a lag. This has a lot to do with what Ken pointed out, reputation. We still had a very good reputation in the 1970s. Oh, in fact, the U.S. Census Bureau makes projections. Ken showed you how good some of them can be. In 1970, the Census Bureau made a projection for the next 30 years of Michigan's population. And basically they did what they often do. They extrapolated the trends of recent decades, and they said that by 2000 we would have a population of 15 million. They were wrong. So the economic base that provided the foundation for the population growth had begun to erode a long time ago, and that's what I'm going to be talking about a lot today. Here is inflation-adjusted income per person. So you take the total income, divide by the number of people. This doesn't say anything about how the income is distributed, although I will get to that in a little bit. And you can see this amazing data set going back all the way to 1929. There's the Great Depression. It's hard to see in this picture, but the Great Depression was way, way, way more severe than what we've just been through. Peak to trough, Michigan's incomes went down by about 40%, whereas in the Great Recession of recent years, we've lost single-digit percents. For much of this time, Michigan was above the national average. Now we've had a very lousy decade in which we fell distinctly below the national average. And again, if you're growing at a straight line, that means your rate of growth is actually slowing down. And so even though the economy is a lot bigger than it was in the 60s and 70s, the rate of growth had already begun to slow, and we had already begun to fall relative to the national average several decades ago. And eventually that reputation catches up with you, and fewer people are migrating into the state. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we averaged about 100,000 per year additional population. That hasn't happened since then. Here, this slide that I just showed you is the levels of per capita income. You can see it more clearly if you express Michigan as a percentage of the U.S. average. And there's 100, so if you're on this line right here, you're at the national average. Well, we were above the national average, sometimes well above the national average, in every year in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We've been below it in most years since then. We fell to 40th among the 50 states in at the depths of the Great Recession. We've now had a few years of recovery. We've made up a little bit of the lost ground. But the long-term trend shown by this black line, which provides the best statistical fit for these data, the long-term trend is not very satisfying. So, and this is the long-term trend in average income. As I said, that doesn't say anything about how the income is distributed. If you talk about how it's distributed, the period since the 1970s was, in a sense, even worse, because it was a time of slowing economic growth and increasing income inequality. In other words, the economic growth that we did have in Michigan was highly concentrated among a relatively small number at the top of the income distribution. The average and the bottom didn't do as well. This is my attempt to do some of this, to show it. This is part of an ongoing research project that involves my colleague at Michigan State, Paul Menschik, where we're looking at the evolution of income distribution, not just level of income on average, but the income distribution in each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. And we begin our analysis using a part of the census called the Current Population Survey, going back to 1976, because it's in the mid-70s that this disequalization began, and it picked up speed in the 1980s. So this compares somebody who's at the 10th percentile or the 20th percentile or the 30th or 40th or the median, that's the 50th percentile. It compares at different places in the income distribution in recent years versus the 70s. We're not comparing the same person. We're not following an individual as he or she goes through the life cycle. We're just looking at the data from recent years and the data in the 70s. A lot of people who were in the data in the 70s are no longer living, so they're not in the more recent data. A lot of the people who were in the data for recent years weren't alive, weren't born yet in the 70s. So we're not tracing a person, but we're saying if you were at the median of the household income distribution in Michigan in 2006, how do you compare with somebody who was at the median 30 years before? Well, the national trend, these showing in black, the national trend is that there's been modest income growth in the middle and at the bottom, and then once you get above the middle, you have accelerating income growth. The data set that we're using here doesn't have, it's not a big enough sample to really say a whole lot about what's happening way at the top. But from other sources, we know that a lot of the action is well above the 90th percentile. 90th percentile, that's ballpark of 130,000 a year. To get into the 99th percentile, you have to be well north of 300, more like 400,000 per year. But even that is, those folks have not experienced the kind of income growth that we have way at the top. The top 100th of 1% has had astonishing income growth. So there's the pattern for the U.S. The middle didn't pull away from the bottom, but the top pulled away from the middle. Well, I show Michigan and the other state that in my view is most like Michigan, which is Ohio, and both of them have the same pattern. The middle did not pull away from the bottom, but the top pulled away from the middle, except that it's the whole distribution is flattened. And what this says is that if you're at the median in Michigan in recent years, how much, if we adjust for inflation, how much is your income higher than somebody who was at the median in the 70s? 4%. That's not 4% per year. That's 4% in a generation. By historical standards, very, very slow income growth. So this decline in overall income growth, accompanied with greater income inequality, that's not going to be very attractive to people from other places who might be thinking of moving. And that's a big part of the story. So where does that come from? The two that I'd like to highlight would be, one, the relative decline of manufacturing, because Michigan was fabulously successful in the middle of the 20th century with manufacturing, and manufacturing has been on decline for a long time. And then what took its place? Well, the high skill parts of the economy are the ones that showed by far the greatest income growth. And for the reasons that have already been discussed here, we have lagged behind for a very long time in the fraction of our population that has a college degree. So the big payoff used to be in manufacturing, and you could be a part of that big payoff without having a whole lot of education. Now the big payoff is in the high skill sectors, and we in Michigan have not done a particularly good job of making that transition. So let's look at both of those. Here is the shrinkage in the relative share of manufacturing as a percentage of the economy in dollar terms. You take all the dollars originating in the manufacturing sector and you express them as a percentage of the entire economy. And the data that can be compared across the 50 states for this go back to 1963. Actually, the relative decline of manufacturing appears to have begun in about 1953 or 54, so it's a very long-term trend. We in Michigan didn't really understand that it was going on, I think, until the 80s, but it had already begun before then. And you can see that for the U.S. as a whole, from 28% down to 12%, that's a fairly substantial relative shrinkage of manufacturing. But for Michigan, because we were so deeply involved in this sector that has struggled, we had an even bigger relative decline from 49% of our economy in the mid-60s to about 12 at the bottom in 2009, and now a rebound to more like 16 or 17% of our economy. But that is a huge transition in less than the lifetime of at least some of the people in this room. So that's one part of the relative decline, and especially the shrinkage of manufacturing meant that there was less of a base for economic prosperity for those without the highest skills. One way to slice that, and this is for national data, not for Michigan, but it gives you an idea. The average guy, this is the median man, so median means half of the people are above you, half are below you. The median man among those who work full-time year-round, how much money did he make in the labor market adjusting for inflation? Well, you can see in the 60s and until 1973, really amazing growth. And men in Michigan shared in that growth. And now the level is lower now than it was in 1973. And who is the median man? One thing we know about him is he probably doesn't have any education beyond high school. And it's the people who do have the education beyond high school who have done much, much better in the last 30 or 40 years. Women have done a little bit better than this. Women have caught up with men. And I'm fine with the gender wage gap going down. I just wish it could have gone down with men improving and women skyrocketing to catch up rather than men being flat and women catching up some. A couple slides ago, I showed you Michigan per capita income as a percentage of the average. And then I want to compare that with the most highly educated state in the country. And you can see that Massachusetts, they were more highly educated than we were 50 years ago, and yet it didn't translate into higher average incomes then because the manufacturing sector was still booming, and the payoff to being a highly educated state was not as large as it is now. And the transformation really began to take place in the 70s and the 80s, and you can see Massachusetts taking off in one direction, and we took off in the other. Now, I've presented this slide before. If you've seen my presentations before, you've seen it. And lots of folks have raised the question, well, is Massachusetts a good one to compare with? And in a sense, it's not. I mean, the question would be, has Massachusetts pursued policies that are smarter than the policies in Michigan? And the answer is not necessarily. Massachusetts has done some things right, some things not right, but Massachusetts largely is lucky. If you sail west from England, you bump into Massachusetts 200 years before you bump into Michigan. And what that means is that Harvard and MIT, for historical reasons, and Tufts and Brandeis and Boston University, the greatest concentration of institutions of high quality institutions of higher learning in the world is in Greater Boston. Okay, they got lucky. We do have U of M and MSU, and we're lucky to have those. But that super big concentration in Metro Boston really has helped Massachusetts. So if a lot of that is just that Massachusetts is lucky, I mean, Wyoming is also lucky because they have a lot of mineral resources, and so their per capita income is higher than it would otherwise be. Well, maybe that means that instead of comparing with the most highly educated state in the country, I should compare with the most highly educated state in the Great Lakes region. So let's do that one. Let's look at Michigan and Minnesota. It's not exactly the same trend as with Massachusetts. You wouldn't expect it to be, but it's pretty similar in terms of Minnesota, the most highly educated state in the Great Lakes region. We used to be about 20% above them. Now we're about 20% below them. And so I think it's not just the lucky special case of Massachusetts. This is a general trend. And this, since my son learned his letters partly with the help of Sesame Street, this slide is brought to you by the letter M. Or maybe I should do my Cookie Monster imitation. This slide is brought to you by the letter M. And if, just look at it for a second, I hope I don't really have to elaborate a whole lot. Okay, let's move on. So what have we done? If Ken and I haven't already convinced you that higher education is important, we probably never will. So what is the policy that has been pursued by Michigan? As he pointed out, this is just amplifying on things that he already said, a policy of systematic disinvestment. As some of you know, I have contacts in MSU's provost's office, and they have kindly presented me with the data for where MSU's money comes from. And 50 some odd years ago, it was 77% from the state of Michigan, 20% from tuition. 20 plus 77 makes 97. The other 3% were federal grants and private giving. Now it's almost exactly reversed. 22% from the state, 70% from tuition. 70 plus 22 makes 92. The other 8 is research grants and private giving and stuff like that. It's not just Michigan State. It's all 15 of the four-year universities supported by the state of Michigan. Supported less and less, but still somewhat supported by the state of Michigan. And you notice that the period from 2003 to 2011 was especially stark. Well, I decided to do the calculation for that period. Instead of reducing all 15 by about the same percentage, we could have done what some people say we should do, which is close some of them. What if you start at the smallest, which is Lake Superior State, you zero out that account, maybe they survive as a private, maybe they don't. How many of those accounts would you have to zero out to be equivalent to the budget cuts of those 9 years? You'd have to zero out, well, here's the list, 12 of the 15. Now, as an employee of one of the 3 that would be left standing, I hasten to add that I am not advocating that policy. I'm glad that Eastern Michigan is still open. I want it to continue. I'm glad that we've got Grand Valley State. But that's just to give you some sense of the magnitude of the withdrawal from support for public education, and that can't be a good thing for the generation that's my son's age. Why is this? Well, one reason, of course, is that for better or worse, in Michigan, you can't win an election by saying we should educate our children or pave our roads, but you can win elections by cutting our taxes. And so this shows the trend of tax revenue as a percentage of personal income. By the way, to make appropriate comparisons across the states, you need to use both state and local, because every state collects some revenue that it then distributes to the locals, but the extent to which it's centralized or decentralized varies from state to state. Therefore, if you only look at state, you get a very misleading impression. Anyhow, and we, by the way, with Proposal A 20 years ago, we went from being unusually decentralized to somewhat unusually centralized in our revenue system. The purpose of this is to show you what a high-tax state looks like. There's New York, it's a high-tax state. There's Michigan, very close to the national average, but we used to be, it's fair to say, above the national average. Now we're right about at the national average, and more importantly, the national average has decreased by about 2 percentage points. So what does that translate into? Ballpark $7-8 billion a year. That's in other words, we tax ourselves in Michigan less than we did 40 years ago, to the tune of about $7 or $8 billion a year. By comparison, the higher education budget is less than $2 billion. And the governor would like a little bit more than $1 billion a year to fix the roads. So a big story is that we've just taxed ourselves less, partly because of explicit reductions in taxes, and partly because all the taxes that we have features that mean that they collect less over time, even if you don't change the tax rates. So I'm not a huge fan of the current clamor for a tax cut. It's coming from both sides of the aisle. I think both of those proposals are misplaced. If the political pressure for a tax cut is overwhelming, I hope it becomes a very small and not one that ties our hands next year and the year after that and the year after that. The last thing that I want to cover has to do with Detroit, but it's talking about the racial element, which I think is one that we need to talk about more. Very highly segregated by race. And I believe that contributes to the problems. I mean, you can disagree with me, but I honestly think if Detroit had a population that was 85% white, we wouldn't have the same problems that we have today. Here is the map that Ken provided in his chapter in the book that I edited. And it is a map of, this is Macomb County, this is Oakland County, this is Wayne County. And it's a mosaic of those 3 counties of the Detroit metro area, where each piece of the mosaic is a census tract, which is basically they have about the same number of people. They're each sort of like a neighborhood, if you will. So the pieces of the mosaic are big in rural areas, and they're smaller in the more urbanized. And it's color-coded by race. If it's more than 80% non-white, the census tract is color-coded as black. If it's less than 20% non-white, it's white, and there are 3 shades of gray in between. This is 8 Mile Road, which I refer to as Michigan's Berlin Wall. I will paraphrase Ronald Reagan. He said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." I'm glad that the Berlin Wall got torn down. It's a good thing for the residents of Berlin and Germany. If we can tear down the Berlin Wall of Michigan, that will be a good thing for us, I believe. I want to, I'm almost done here, Anne Marie, I'm almost done. For the U.S. as a whole, so I want to talk about black-white earnings. So here is the trend for the United States as a whole. I'm comparing, again, I'm taking the median person, the median black man who works full-time year-round compared to the median white man who works full-time year-round, and the median black woman who works full-time year-round compared to the median white woman who works full-time year-round. And you can see that for women, there was the ratio increased. In other words, black women were increasing faster than white women until 1973, and then since then it's been a slightly downward trend. For men, it's been a slightly upward trend, but this is for the nation as a whole. And if you think about the different states that make up the nation, the treatment of African Americans relative to whites has evolved in very different ways. And in Michigan, the blacks, after all, a century ago, we were almost completely white. Why do we have 13% of our population who's of African descent? That's because of the Great Migration, which was mostly between about 1915 and the late 60s. And then it stopped. So why did those folks move here? Same reason that a lot of whites from the South moved here. They moved here for economic opportunity, in particular in the manufacturing sector. How has the manufacturing sector done? Not as well. And so this is again from this current population survey, which I'm using. It is not a full census, and it only has, in a typical year, it has about 100 black men who are working full-time year-round, and it has several hundred white men. Well, if you're taking the median of a sample that has sampling error, and it's a sample of only 100, and then you're comparing with that with the median, and then you're taking of a different sample, and you're taking the average, there's noise in those data. Okay, so don't put too much stress on any one of these numbers. But this shows the median earnings for black men, full-time year-round earners, as a percentage of median earnings for white men for Michigan and Georgia. And 30, 40 years ago, black men were almost on par with white men in Michigan. And in Georgia, a gap of 40%. Now it's a tie. Why? Well, think about who is the black man in the 70s in Georgia. He didn't have any white schoolmates. He was prohibited by law from going to the same school as a white person. He grew up under Jim Crow, where the central organizing principle of Southern society was white supremacy and black subjugation. And I'm not saying that Georgia is now a racial paradise, but it's better than it used to be. In other words, Georgia did, in the last 40 years, what we had done long before. And then we have a black population that was disproportionately involved in manufacturing and have done not as well. Now, I'm not sure if that's a great place to stop, but I got to stop because my time is out, but I don't want to stop without singing the state song. And Kathy Hoffman. Hi, Kathy Cusick. Hi. But I'm pointing to Kathy Hoffman, who did some of the research on identifying what the heck is our state song. So this is the first version of one of our many state songs, and you can join me in singing it to the tune of "Oh Christmas Tree." A song to thee, fair state of mine, Michigan, my Michigan, but greater song than this is thine, Michigan, my Michigan. The whisper of the forest tree, the thunder of the inland sea, unite in one grand symphony of Michigan, my Michigan. Give yourselves a round of applause.